invite Professor Rajni Kaur Madam for the discussion and management of this case, how it was done.
So, before I present my slides, let us discuss this case very briefly. This child was very obviously having hemolytic anemia, which was evidenced by severe anemia and increased reticulocyte count. That is why his MCV was also increased, because probably he has a lot of retics in the peripheral blood. LDH was raised and he had indirect hemoglobin. So these are all markers of hemolytic anemia. In addition to that, he is DCT positive, and so that makes up the diagnosis of autoimmune hemolytic anemia. Right? Unfortunately, whenever we do DCT, it is very important that we do a detailed immunoglobulin workup. Probably this was not done in this child because he was not affording it, and probably it was not available at Vivekananda. We had to send it to PGI. So what I was told that he could not afford to do that. And then I will just briefly talk about autoimmune hemolytic anemia, and then we'll discuss all these things again. And in between, you can keep asking me questions. You're most welcome to interrupt me also.
Yes. I'll ask either you or maybe even Siddharth. Do we have a corrected count? See, there is one very important finding here. People will look at the TLC and think that this is all sepsis, but actually we need to deduct the number of nucleated red cells and you will get the corrected TLC.
And then we need to highlight the importance of a peripheral blood smear here.
Yes.
Often we tend to overlook a peripheral blood smear because that may be giving up a lot of diagnosis to us. And I think he only reported in the last or the second last film about that he had a lot of nucleated RBCs. Right? The first thing, when you get high counts in this scenario, you should really, especially when you're thinking reticulocyte count is also increased, we must look at the peripheral blood smear and look for nucleated RBCs. Because nucleated RBCs in an automated counter are counted as WBCs because they are nucleated.
Correct.
Okay, so here this was not sepsis related increase in TLC. The TLC was falsely raised because of the counter counting all the nucleated RBCs as WBCs. Isn't that what you wanted to say, Dr. Banani?
Yes, ma'am.
So I'll briefly talk about autoimmune hemolytic anemia.
I think in Lucknow, we do not see so much of intravenous or intravascular hemolysis. In Chandigarh, because we used to have a lot of patients with G6PD deficiency, Punjab is having more of G6PD deficiency. Right. So it was a routine to see patients with intravascular hemolysis, and we were, as junior residents, quite well versed with managing it. Autoimmune, of course, we saw very little of autoimmune hemolysis.
But I think even here we see more of G6PD as compared to autoimmune hemolytic.
Right, definitely.
It's not such a common thing to see autoimmune hemolytic anemia. I think we see.
And madam, in some regions of Uttar Pradesh, we are having hemolysis because of falciparum malaria, very predominant cause.
Yeah, that is true, but then that is not autoimmune hemolytic anemia. You have a cause
that becomes an infection then.
That becomes an infection.
Malaria.
And so we will just talk about that.
One more thing I was just wanted to know, if there is an hemolysis, is it not better to do a post diuresis along with the extraction of urine in order to save the kidneys?
Sorry, do what in the urine?
Forced diuresis he talked of.
No, if the urine output is very good, so why should you do in any case, he was giving a transfusion and he was overloaded. So there will be
diuresis of urine so that kidneys can be saved.
Okay, maybe
no, not only diuretics, even you can skip the diuretic.
We'll keep that question for later, Dr. Ajay. I'm sure somebody will answer that question during the course of their presentation.
Okay.
Either ma'am or maybe Dr. Nishant, one of them should be having it, I'm sure.
Banani ma'am, can I have one question in this case?
Yeah, go ahead.
Antibiotic was started. What was the reason of antibiotic? Is there any sign of infection? Or
So
Uh,
this is what
Ma'am
we
is
were
there. Ma'am will
discussing.
answer that.
Probably it
Discussion,
was
discussion,
falsely
ma'am.
thought of as an infection. And remember that in hemolytic anemia, you can get rise in ESR2 and you can also get a rise in C-reactive proteins because it's an inflammatory condition. Okay.
Child presented with fever for 3 months.
PCT was also increased.
Actually, PCT was also high. PCT came positive. That's how it started.
Okay, but
Okay.
even then, I think mostly these are viral infections which are causing, and I'll come to that just now. Can you? Can you see
we
my
can see your screen, but it is not full screen. Yeah, you go to slideshow.
Yeah, I'm doing that.
Yes, ma'am.
So
Now we
can you see my slides
Yeah.
now?
Yes, ma'am.
So briefly, let us see what is autoimmune hemolytic anemia. This is characterized by production of antibodies that bind to antigens on the erythrocyte surface, and this causes destruction of RBC, thus shortening the lifespan. If this destruction is high at a high enough rate and exceeds the bone marrow's capacity to regenerate, the patient develops anemia, and the severity of anemia depends upon the amount of hemolysis that is going on. And obviously, the associated signs and symptoms will be related to the severity of anemia. When we talk about epidemiology, it is a relatively rare disorder in children, most often seen after a recent viral illness, and can be seen throughout childhood. However, in teenagers, this is more likely to have an underlying systemic illness, and therefore we need to have attention to this child because we need to do more investigations. The incidence is not precisely known, but in children below 20 years of age, it is estimated to be less than 0.2 per 100,000. The highest rates are seen in preschool children. When we to classify autoimmune hemolytic anemia, as per pathogenesis, it can be defined as primary, post-infective, or secondary. Primary is basically where we do not know the cause, so it is also called idiopathic. This is about 37% of cases, and they include warm reactive, cold reactive, and paroxysmal cold hemoglobinuria. Then post-infective and secondary are directly attributable to underlying another systemic illness, and this is about 53%. And these can be resulting from a systemic autoimmune disease, malignancy, or medications. So talking about primary AIHA, it is mostly following viral infections. The hemolysis seen is mainly extravascular, with sequestration mainly occurring in the spleen and liver. And the most commonly involved immunoglobulin is IgG, which is directed at the RBC surface proteins. But it can also be directed by IgM autoantibodies, which are reacting with RBC polysaccharides. In most of the children, it is acute, and these acute cases carry a better prognosis. Often there's a spontaneous resolution within 6 months. Chronic are not so common, say about 30%, but they're typically much more difficult to treat. And they're more commonly seen in children below 2 years of age or in teenagers. So actually, gradually, as we are diagnosing more and more infections, we are able to diagnose them. So we are shifting more from primary to secondary causes. So once you diagnose the infection, then it comes into a secondary autoimmune hemolytic anemia. So the secondary autoimmune hemolytic anemia, what are the causes? The warm type of AIHA, most common is Evans syndrome. It is due to infections like EB virus, parvovirus, mycoplasma, and CMV. And a lot of primary immune deficiencies or immune dysregulation syndromes, which are mentioned here. And autoimmune diseases like SLE, hepatitis, thyroiditis, antiphospholipid syndrome, infantile giant cell hepatitis. Then we have the cold agglutinin disease, which is mainly because of infections like mycoplasma, other viral infections including EBV, and a very important area when we have a lot of bone marrow transplants now is post-transplantation. Paroxysmal cold hemoglobinuria is mainly following infections, and they could be adenoviruses, syphilis, CMV, EB virus, varicella zoster virus, measles, and mumps. Classification of autoimmune hemolytic anemia can be done in several ways. First of all, the immunoglobulin class which is involved. They could be IgG, IgM, or it could be due to complement activation. Or this could be classified by the thermal properties of the autoantibodies, and this is what we just talked about. It could be warm AIHA, cold agglutinin disease, paroxysmal cold hemoglobinuria, or mixed forms. Warm autoimmune hemolytic anemia is direct antiglobulin positive for IgG or IgG plus complement component 3. The IgG antibodies are mainly directed against epitopes of the Rh system, and this could be idiopathic, which means primary or secondary to autoimmune lymphoproliferative or neoplastic disease. Cold autoimmune hemolytic anemia is of two types, either cold agglutinin disease. These are DAT positive for CD3 component and IgM directed against the I1 system on the RBCs. This again could either be primary or secondary to infections. Generally, it is acute or transitory if it's following infections, or chronic, especially if it is related to lymphoproliferative diseases, which is much more common in adults. Paroxysmal cold hemoglobinuria, this is due to Donat-Landsteiner test positive. These are bithermic IgG directed against the erythrocyte P antigen. And again, there could be idiopathic or secondary to syphilis, which could be chronic, or other infections which are more acute. Then there could be mixed autoimmune hemolytic anemias, which again direct antiglobulin positive for IgG and CD3. There's coexisting of warm IgG antibodies with higher titer of IgM cold agglutinins. And idiopathic can be secondary to many. So let us see what are the characteristics of the typical various forms of autoimmune hemolytic anemia. First, we said warm antibodies. These are the most common autoimmune hemolytic anemias, about 60 to 70%. And classically, when we do the direct antiglobulin test, it will be either IgG positive or IgG plus complement CD3 positive. The IgG class is IgG, and they are optimally at 34 to 37 degrees. They have an ability to fix complement, which is very little. They are mainly directed at the anti-Rh on the RBC, and most of the hemolysis is extravascular. In cold antibody types, it's about 20 to 25. Classically, these are negative for IgG, but they may be CD3 positive, and the IgG class is IgM, which its activity at 4 to 7 degrees centigrade, 4 to 27 degrees centigrade, and they have a lot of ability to fix the complement. They are directed against the anti-I, and this could be presenting as either extravascular or intravascular hemolysis. The cold paroxysmal hemoglobinuria is only very little. It's about 6 to 12%. These are again negative for IgG, but they could be CD3 positive. The IgG could be biphasic, fixing at either 4 to 7 and lysing at 34 to 37 degrees, which means at cold atmosphere, the antibodies tend to get fixed and there could be acrocyanosis at that time. But the lysis may occur later on, even at higher temperatures. They have a high ability to fix the complement, and therefore it is mainly intravascular, and they are directed against the anti-P antigen on the surface of the RBC. The mixed type of anti-erythrocyte autoantibodies, they are very only about 5%. They could be either IgG alone positive, or IgG plus complement CD3, or the CD3 complement alone. And the IgG class could be both IgG and IgM. Again, the IgG will be avid at 34 to 37 degrees, while IgM at 4 to 27 degrees. Their avidity to fix complement is lesser, and they are directed against the anti-RH as well as anti-I, and therefore they are extravascular as well as intravascular hemolysis. So what is the mechanism of autoimmune RBC destruction? The antibodies are mainly formed by the B cells. They secrete, if it's the IgG class, they go and coat the RBCs, and they can directly coat the antigen, and they may directly be phagocytized by the splenic macrophages. And therefore, they will be producing extravascular hemolysis. And they could also be fixed to the complement. But again, they could be going to these C3 receptors, and again, they could be having engulfed by the splenic macrophages. The IgM class of antibodies, they are agglutinating antibodies, so the RBCs tend to get agglutinated to each other. And when we look at the peripheral blood smear, we will find that there are a lot of agglutinated RBCs. Then we have the complement fixation to membrane, and this is typically causing intravascular RBC lysis and causing hemoglobin. So how do we diagnose AIHA? But the common symptoms which we saw in this child was also fever, fatigue, pallor, and all the problems related to anemia like confusion, lightheadedness, dizziness, and weakness. Less commonly, we can get jaundice, which is mainly indirect jaundice, dark urine, tachycardia, depending upon the degree of anemia, similarly enlarged heart, and then we get splenomegaly or hepatomegaly or both, because spleen is the primary area where RBC get destroyed, especially in the extravascular hemolysis. To diagnose, the lab investigations are typically the classical ones of hemolytic anemia. What is that? Decreased hemoglobin, reticulocytosis, indirect hyperbilirubinemia, elevated serum LDH, low haptoglobulins, and with or without hemoglobin. But to make a diagnosis of AIHA, in addition to these, we should have a direct positive antiglobulin test. Okay, so this is the very important, the lab investigations of hemolytic anemia plus the presence of anti-RBC bodies detected by positive direct antiglobulin test. So what are the first level tests that we do? The WBC count, and what I was highlighting earlier, RBC morphology on the peripheral blood smear is very important. A reticulocyte count obviously is very important because it is telling us what is the degree of erythropoiesis which is happening. But what is very important to remember, that you could have about 39 to 40% of children who do not have a rise in reticulocyte count. And this is very important for diagnosis, remember. Because in about 39% of children, there could be reticulocytopenia. And why can this happen? What happened? These antibodies may be directed against the erythroid precursors. So if the precursors are destroyed and hemolyzed, then obviously the number of RBCs are going to be less. Or there could be apoptosis of bone marrow erythroblasts, or also infection by parvovirus. And this parvovirus goes and infects the pronormoblasts. Therefore, again, these are apoptotic and they are not producing RBCs very well. So these are the situations because of which you could have reticulocytopenia and not reticulocytosis, and we should be aware about this. Hemoglobinuria is found in cases of intravascular hemolysis, and remember, it can be manifested by overtly dark urine. But it's very important to look at this urine. Typically, we will not have any RBCs on microscopy. So it is not hematuria, it is hemoglobinuria. Hemoglobin will be positive. So this is what I'm showing you here. This first slide is of warm antibody AIHA. What are we seeing here? Look at these spherocytes. You can hardly see any central pallor. What happens is that gradually, because of the antibody attack, the membrane gets bitten off and the membranes become smaller and smaller. Therefore, these become spherocytes. So we are getting a lot of spirocytes in this cell. Not only that, look at this, it's a nucleated RBC here. And then we are having some larger cells also, which are better hemoglobin. And these are more of reticulocytes, polychromatophilic RBCs. So this is what we will get in a peripheral blood smear of a warm autoantibody AIHA. And this is typically what agglutinated RBCs, which will be seen in Kroll agglutinin disease. And this is again highlighting the importance of the peripheral blood smear. So when do we do second level tests? Only when we are thinking of an underlying disorder or a secondary autoimmune hemolytic anemia. But yes, extensive blood cell typing should be done in the anticipation of a possible transfusion, because it is very difficult to cross-match RBCs in these children because of the antibodies which are present on them. Then further immune hematological investigations, we should be doing the C3, C4 and the complete complementaries. Then we should look for, if we are suspecting autoimmune disorders, should look at ANA, anti-DNA, antiphospholipid antibodies and rheumatoid factor. Thyroid function and anti-thyroid antibodies like anti-TG and anti-TPO if we are thinking of autoimmune thyroiditis. Then lymphocyte subpopulations are very important, and especially look at this one, the double negative T cells, which are CD3 positive but negative CD4 and CD8 and TCR alpha beta positive. These are typical for ALPS, which may be an underlying disorder, especially in many of the adult and older children. Then hepatitis B and C markers and HIV serology, a coagulation screen of blood, and total serum protein and protein electrophoresis. There are obviously immunoglobulin class quantification like IgA, IgM, and IgG, C-reactive proteins, and if we are suspecting infections, EBV, CMV, parvovirus B19, and HSV serology. Other assessments will be depending upon what kind of a secondary disorder we are suspecting. And as I said earlier, in younger children, we should be thinking more about primary immunodeficiencies, whereas in older children, it should be more about autoimmune infection, other types of autoimmune diseases. This is one study which I picked up. It's an Indian study done from AIIMS, which is telling us they found that in about 26 cases, they found 17 were idiopathic, whereas 9 were secondary. In the secondary ones, the age was slightly higher, the duration was longer, and even the time to response here was longer. And what were in the secondary causes? The most important were autoimmune conditions. These were 56%, out of which Evans syndrome, SLE, and GRA were there. Among infections, they were CMV and rubella. And the other were endocrine diseases and nephritis. So this is what we talked about in secondary. These are the kinds which we tend to see in India. So what is the immune hematological diagnosis? This is mainly direct antiglobulin test and indirect antiglobulin test. So what do we do in the direct antiglobulin tests? It demonstrates the autoantibodies adhering to the RBCs. Okay, so these are detecting the antigens which are adhering to the RBCs, and we add free IgG, anti-IgG AG reagent, which causes agglutination. Whereas the indirect antiglobulin test is detecting the free antibodies in the serum. So when we perform the direct antiglobulin test, it is first performed with polyspecific sera, which is capable of identifying both IgG and C3. There are various methods used. They have the different sensitivities and specificities, and the gel technique is much more sensitive than the ones that were commonly used.
Madam, just one query here. Is this DAT and IAT same as Coombs test?
Yes, direct antibody test is direct Coombs test, and the indirect antiglobulin test is the indirect Coombs test. Okay. If the screening with direct antiglobulin test with polyspecific sera is positive, then you should use monospecific anti-IgG and anti-C3 antiserum. So that we can identify whether these kind of antibodies are present. All are present, only one is present. Or what? There can be a problem in diagnosis of AIHA, and especially when they are the classical signs of hemolytic anemia or absent or difficult to interpret. Often what happens, we think this jaundice is because of a liver disease or something, and we do not think about autoimmune hemolytic anemia. This I've already discussed. Reticulocytosis can be absent in about 39% of pediatric cases. And this can be happening because it's very early in the disease when reticulocytosis has not happened, or when autoantibodies also attack the erythrocyte progenitors, which we talked about earlier. Or what happens...
Ma'am, can I say one thing here, please?
Sure.
I think if a patient is deficient in folic acid and B12, then also the reticulocytes will not come up because the bone marrow cannot respond.
Absolutely right.
And that's not a very uncommon situation, especially in teenagers and things like that.
Absolutely, that's right. Then the direct antiglobulin test can be very weakly positive or even negative in up to 10% of cases. And then we think, this is not autoimmune hemolytic anemia. And what are the mechanisms for this? The number of RBC-bound antibodies may be below the level of detection using the visual agglutination test. So if we do more sensitive tests, maybe we'll be able to pick up more. Or the positive autoantibodies may be warm-reacting IgM or IgA, not detected by the conventional anti-IgG reagents. Or the RBC-bound antibodies may be lost during the procedure because of low affinity binding, and so they disassociated from the RBCs. So if it is that negative, but if you have a very high suspicion of autoimmune hemolytic anemia, alternative enhanced DAT assays can be done. And we can use low ionic strength washing solutions, anti-IgA, anti-sera, and more sensitive flow-based DAT assays can be done. But it depends if they are available in your hospital, or you can refer them to some other place. Patients with DAT negative AIHA appear to have a more severe course and a higher mortality. But we are not sure why this is happening. Maybe it is because there's a delay in diagnosis and starting therapy, or maybe there's an inherent character of this disorder. So now remember, in a differential diagnosis, obviously we'll have all other hemolytic anemias which are non-immune mediated. And I will not go into the details of all of this. There could be these congenital forms with the membrane disorders, or there could be hemoglobinopathies, Wilson's disease, from mechanical causes like synthetic heart valves, March hemoglobinuria, or cardiopulmonary bypass, or there could be vascular injury, which is microangiopathic hemolytic anemia. And in this scenario also, we could be getting some degree of spherocytes. Hemolytic anemia due to thermal damage like extensive burns or some chemicals, and hemolytic anemia, as Dr. Sanjay was talking about, mycoplasma, pneumonia, Clostridium welchi, and malaria in protozoa, and herpes virus and other disorders. So these are actually, they are hemolytic anemias, but they are not autoimmune hemolytic anemia.
Madam,
so having once made the diagnosis by exclusion,
Madam, here can I make one conclusion that if we have normocytic normochromic anemia,
yes,
then we do retic count, spherocytes, and direct Coombs test.
Yeah.
So can this algorithm diagnose this autoimmune hemolytic anemia?
First of all, you have to confirm the diagnosis of hemolytic anemia.
Right.
With all the things we talked about, anemia, reticulocytosis, increased LDH, indirect hyperbilirubinemia, low haptoglobulins, and maybe hemoglobinuria, which may or may not be there. These, along with a positive direct antiglobulin test, and which will be additionally that when you look at the peripheral blood smear, you will find a lot of spherocytes in the warm type, right? and evidences of nucleated RBCs or increased reticulocytosis. Whereas in the IgM type, you may be getting pure, it will be very diagnostic, will be finding agglutinating RBCs.
Yeah, but the problem comes when patient comes to you after having received 1 or 2 transfusions. You know, that
True.
is where you
Absolutely.
end up with real difficulties. Or he has come very late, he is already in renal failure, and you get only some history that he has passed dark colored urine 1 or 2 days.
True. True.
Somebody gave transfusions, so you neither have urine nor you have the blood smear, and you have to basically blood smear, if it still continues to hemolyze, you will get something, but sometimes it does become difficult.
True. Also, it could be confused with the hemolytic blood transfusion reaction.
Correct.
Yeah,
Correct.
so you do
Yes,
not
ma'am.
know whether it is a hemolytic blood transfusion reaction which is happening. It is the autoimmune hemolytic anemia.
Yeah, absolutely. Right.
Okay, so this may be a complicating factor also. So when we talk about treatment of autoimmune hemolytic anemia, we have to have some response criteria. A complete response is achievement of a hemoglobin concentration which is more than or equal to the lower limit of normal for age, with no signs of hemolysis, which means the reticulocytes should have normalized and the bilirubin concentration should be normal. A partial response is an increase of hemoglobin of at least 2 grams per deciliter without hemoglobin concentration reaching a normal value for the patient's age. No response is an increase of hemoglobin less than 2 grams per deciliter, or a child is completely dependent on recurrent transfusions. So what is the frontline treatment? It depends on the type of autoantibodies, the clinical severity, additional or underlying conditions, and the age of the patient. Mostly if you are finding that the child has come with severe anemia, is very sick, then blood transfusion in the acute setting is a life-saving intervention. And I will not talk about it. I'll leave it to Dr. Nishant to talk about this. Corticosteroids, they are the traditional first line of therapy in warm autoimmune hemolytic anemia. For severe clinical presentations, IV methylprednisolone 1 to 4 milligram per kg per day divided every 6 to 8 hours, or 30 milligram per kg per day into 3 days may be used. Then we should transit to oral prednisolone 1 to 2 milligram per kg per day for at least 2 to 3 weeks until the hemoglobin is at least 10 to 11 without the need for transfusions and with reduced reticulocytosis. The reticulocytosis should have definitely decreased. For less severe clinical presentations, we can just keep the child with oral corticosteroids, and this could be just the initial treatment of choice. So it depends on many of these conditions. Second line treatment are rituximab, splenectomy, and other immunosuppressive therapies which may be steroid sparing. Rituximab is a chimeric monoclonal antibody with specificity against the CD20 B cell surface marker. Generally, it is the preferred second line of therapy for children with younger age and the warm type of autoimmune hemolytic anemia. The dose is what we give in oncology, 375 milligram per meter square intravenously for 4 weeks. Recently, lower doses have been used, 100 milligram per meter square per dose weekly into 4. Splenectomy, it is less effective and generally, especially where spleen is not involved in the hemolytic process. Remember that, especially in the cold type, it may not be effective at all. Also, it should be avoided in younger children for the thinking that they could be landing up with sepsis. Also, it's very important to exclude an underlying immune deficiency because these children are at a very high risk of post-splenectomy sepsis and death. So, splenectomy is really comes much lower down now in our therapy. And now we are using more steroid-sparing immunosuppressive therapies if the child is not responding to corticosteroids, or if we are having to give it for a very long term. One is mycophenolate mofetil, which inhibits de novo purine synthesis by selectively inhibiting the inosine monophosphate dehydrogenase, which is present in the proliferating T and B lymphocytes. Or what is also recently used is sirolimus. Both of these are being now extensively used in children when they're having chronic autoimmune hemolytic anemia, where steroids need to be given at a higher dose for a longer time. The third line therapies are other immunosuppressive agents for refractory autoimmune hemolytic anemia. They are more toxic and less effective, and there's a big list: azathioprine, cyclophosphamide, cyclosporin A, vincristine, 6-MP, and danazol. The last resort is alemtuzumab, which is a humanized anti-CD52 antibody and targets B and T lymphocytes, and high-dose cyclophosphamide, 50 milligram per kg per day for 4 days. But these are quite highly toxic, so therefore they are called as last resort options. We have some recent novel agents coming, and these are bortezomib, which targets the long-living plasma cells. Remember, these are the ones which will be producing the antibodies. Or ofatumumab. This is a fully human monoclonal anti-CD20 antibody. It has a superior complement-mediated cytotoxicity as compared to rituximab. So those patients who are not responding to rituximab, it will be preferable in these. Or eculizumab. This is an anti-C5 terminal complement inhibitor used to treat cases of refractory autoimmune hemolytic anemia. So, if you have a warm AIHA, there's rapid hemolysis and severe anemia, give methylprednisolone and consider blood transfusion, and even you may consider IVIG. If it is not so, we can just start with oral prednisolone. If there's a good response, then just slowly taper over 6 to 12 months and discontinue after that. If there's only a partial response, you must evaluate for a secondary cause, and especially when no response or when there's a relapse after trying to taper steroids, you must evaluate a secondary cause. And if you find a secondary cause, treat the underlying disease. Or we can start the second line therapy, which in children we've already said, rituximab or MMF or sirolimus. And later on, third line is splenectomy or cyclosporin A, 6-MP azathioprine. And then again, if there's no response, then what are the last options which we discussed earlier? Treatment of cold AIHA. The first line therapy here is rituximab, 375 milligram per meter square weekly for 4 weeks. Here, the steroids are not that effective, and rituximab is the first therapy. And of course, folic acid is given to all of the autoimmune hemolytic anemia. What is very important is that we must keep the patient as well as the infused products warm. If you're giving saline, fluids, blood, they should all be kept warm. The second line is again rituximab with bendamustine, 90 milligram per meter square, day 1 and 2 every 28 days into 4. The third line is the other ones which we talked about, bortezomib, eculizumab, and fludarabine. The last one is paroxysmal cold hemoglobinuria. It is the rarest form of AIHA. It is because of cold reactive IgG antibodies, typically against the erythrocyte P antigen.
This is different from PNH, is it?
It is totally, no, it is totally different from PNH.
Okay.
And you need to differentiate it from PNH because there you will be having the different CD59 and 55 positive, which will not be so in this case.
Okay.
Okay. And they fix the complement avidly and lead to acute hemolytic anemia. This is frequently identified after a bacterial or viral infection. Most of them are self-limiting. And the diagnostic test is the Donat-Landsteiner test, which is different from the PIG anchored proteins, which we do in the paroxysmal nocturnal hemoglobin. Okay, so they are two different. This can persist for about 1 to 3 months, but is almost always self-limiting. Blood transfusion may be necessary at the time of initial clinical presentation, and in severe cases, corticosteroids may be of benefit, but again, this may be only. So what is the mechanism of action of the various therapies we saw? Rituximab acts on the CD20 cells, which are the B cells, which are producing the antibodies, and even MMF, sirolimus, these alemtuzumab also act here. whereas MMF, sirolimus, CSA, and alemtuzumab also act on the T helper cells. Bortezomib, it's quite a mouthful. They act on the plasma cells and again decrease the antibody production. Corticosteroids also reduce the antibody production, and plasmapheresis also removes these antibodies. Then when we're talking about the IgG mediated one, which is mainly happening in spleen, and here this may be phagocytosis at FcY receptors of the spleen, which will be inhibited by corticosteroids to some extent. Or IVIG will also be acting here in this scenario. If it is a IgM mediated, it is also activating the complement system. So in the C1 component of the activating system, it is the C1 esterase inhibitors will be acting, whereas eculizumab will be acting at the C5, which we talked about earlier. So these are the areas, where the various therapies are acting, just to have a better idea about that. So I think that is the end of my slide. And thank you for your attention. If there's anything which I have not been able to explain, you want to ask questions, you're most welcome.
Thank you, madam, for the excellent explanation, for sensitizing us on autoimmune anemia. We will have the questions in the last, after the presentation of Dr. Nishant Verma, for the respect of time. So many of our times we have heard about hemolytic crisis, and this patient was also in ICU and ventilated also. So Dr. Nishant Verma, for your presentation on ICU care of hemolytic anemia.
Yeah, good evening, everybody.
Upfront, Nishant said that he has been very busy with the COVID, and so he has not given much attention to this. So, whom all have you been vaccinating, Nishant? Everybody in KGMC.
Whoever is coming. Plus 60 plus, and everybody who is coming. Everybody is being vaccinated.
So, all the hospitals have this additional responsibility of taking on senior citizens. So, that's good.
Yes, ma'am.
Sure. Go ahead.
Is my screen visible? Full screen? I hope so.
Yeah, you can see it.
So there is some problem with my internet, so the slides may move a bit slowly. So kindly bear with me. So I would be talking about ICU needs of a child with hemolytic anemia. But fortunately, children with hemolytic anemia very rarely need an ICU care. It is the older patients, because those who with chronic hemolytic anemia, as they grow old, the comorbidities keep on accumulating, the complications keep on increasing. So the adults with hemolytic anemia need ICU care more as compared to children, but still, once in a while, we have to care for a child with hemolytic anemia in the ICU. Now let us see what are these conditions which require ICU admission in a child with hemolytic anemia. And the foremost is the case which we saw just now, a child with acute severe hemolysis. And this could be either because of autoimmune hemolytic anemia or because of a child with G6PD deficiency, which is an X-linked recessive condition. A child with severe anemia because of any hemolytic disorder, be it thalassemia major, be it sickle cell anemia. If the child has not been taking transfusions, he may develop severe pallor, which may lead to CHF, and such a case child will also require ICU care. Then coming to the third category is sickle cell disease. Now, sickle cell disease is a disease which has numerous complications because of the disease pathogenesis. So the complications which frequently require ICU care are acute chest syndrome, sequestration crisis, aplastic crisis, and CNS crisis, which is stroke. Then in thalassemia major, if a child with thalassemia major has undergone splenectomy, then he's prone for opportunistic post-splenectomy infections, also in short called as OPSI. And a child with OPSI can require ICU care because of the severity of infection. Then a child with Thal major who has not been properly chelated, there would be iron deposited in his heart, and such a child may develop cardiomyopathy. But again, uncommon in children, more common in adults. And the last category is transfusion reaction. So a child needing transfusion may develop any life-threatening transfusion reaction needing ICU care. Now, I would be focusing more on the acute severe hemolysis, severe anemia, and sickle cell disease. Transfusion reactions I'm not going to deal, and Thal major, because it is not these complications are not common in children, so I'll not touch upon them. So just to give you an idea about the types, which already Madam had discussed, this extravascular and intravascular hemolysis. So clinically, you need to differentiate a child with extravascular hemolysis or intravascular hemolysis. So in extravascular hemolysis, classically again seen in conditions like thalassemia major, in warm type of AIHA, there are antibody-coated RBCs which are phagocytosed by macrophages in the liver and spleen, and the hemolysis happens outside the blood circulation. That is why the name extravascular. And because of the breakdown of RBCs, the bilirubin would be formed, which would be, some amount would be cleared, but because the production of bilirubin is higher than the capacity of liver, so child would present with jaundice. On the other hand, in the case of intravascular hemolysis, the breakdown of RBC happens then and there in the circulation itself. It could be either because of direct lysis of the RBCs, or because of stress, or because of toxins like some snake envenomations, or complement-mediated lysis, as in the case of paroxysmal cold hemoglobinuria, also called as PCH. So in these conditions, there is intravascular hemolysis, and this is characterized by the release of free hemoglobin and hemoglobin urea. In extravascular hemolysis, there is no hemoglobin urea, while in intravascular hemolysis, there is hemoglobin urea, and this free hemoglobin in circulation binds to haptoglobin, so the haptoglobin levels in circulation decrease. So it can be identified by hemoglobin urea and decrease in haptoglobin levels. Now coming to the first condition, that is autoimmune hemolytic anemia. As again already told, that it can be potentially fatal, but it is a rare entity. We rarely see, even being a tertiary care referral center, we see not more than 3-4 children with AIHA in a year, but we have to be well versed with identifying and treating this condition because it can be potentially fatal. There is lack of evidence-based treatment. Most of the treatment which is advocated is based on expert opinion because there are no randomized studies because of the rarity of this disease. The rest of management of AIHA has already been discussed by Archana ma'am. What I would be talking is transfusion in a child with AIHA, because these children present with anemia, they will require transfusion. So what are the indications of transfusing a child with AIHA? If the hemoglobin is less than 6 grams per DA, if there is symptomatic anemia, or if there is rapid decline in hemoglobin. So rapid decline in hemoglobin would produce symptomatic anemia. And such patients will require ICU care because a precipitous decline in hemoglobin can lead to CHF and child would require ICU care. Now, what is the major challenge? So major challenge is in warm AIHA because cross-matching is unsuccessful because these children have antibodies bound in their circulation. So whenever we go to cross-match, the blood bank would be unable to find a matched unit for these children. So cross-matching is unsuccessful. So what should we do? So the strategy which is again followed worldwide is transfuse after ruling out allo antibodies. So because autoantibodies are already there, we only have to rule out allo antibodies. So now what are allo antibodies? A word about them. So to rule out allo antibodies, the ideal testing would be doing an extended cross-matching. So by the routine cross-matching which we do is A, B, O and RH. Extended cross-matching would include the complete phenotyping of RBC, which would include KEL, Duffy, KID, and all the other minor blood groups have to be matched for the particular RBC. But it's a very time-consuming and expensive procedure. So we do not have the luxury of so much time in a child with AIHA. We can't wait for the extended cross-matching results to come, which may sometimes take even 24 hours. So we have to strike a careful balance because the risk of allo antibody is extremely low in transfusion naive children. So children, this problem is more in adults who have received transfusions in past, in females who have had delivered babies in past, so they can have allo antibodies. But transfusion naive children, the risk of allo antibody is negligible. On the other hand, the risk of delaying transfusion is much more. So we just have to choose the least incompatible blood. So again, I'll give you an example. Suppose you have a O positive child with warm type of AIHA who presents with life-threatening severe anemia and you need to transfuse. Then what the blood bank will do is choose few units of O positive blood, run a cross match, and the least compatible O positive blood will be issued. We do not go for the extended allo antibody evaluation. But if the child is not sick and the transfusion may be delayed for some time, maybe for 24 hours, then again, we would always prefer to do an extended cross-matching because the child already has autoantibodies. You do not want to cause hemolysis because of alloantibodies as well. So alloantibodies are antibodies in the child's blood against the donor RBCs. Autoantibodies are RBCs against the RBCs of the patient himself or herself. Now coming to transfusion in a child with acute hemolytic anemia due to G6PD deficiency. The good thing about G6PD deficiency is the hemolysis is self-limiting. So majority of these patients do not require transfusion. You just have to stop the drug which led to hemolysis. So in G6PD deficiency, exposure to drugs like quinine, exposure to fava beans, this leads to hemolysis. But hemolysis is self-limiting because the newer RBCs which are coming in the circulation, the G6PD level in those RBCs are good. So hemolysis on itself stops once the mature RBCs are finished. So the hemolysis is self-limiting. However, few of these patients may need transfusion if the hemoglobin is less than 7 or if the hemoglobin is less than 9 and there is persistent brisk hemolysis which is indicated by presence of hemoglobin urea. So hemoglobin urea, if it is happening, it means there is continuous hemolysis which is happening. So even if the hemoglobin is less than 9, you would go on and transfuse a child with G6PD deficiency. Now, one question which was being raised was hemoglobin urea leading to AKI. Now, this is an exceedingly rare in children. So children with hemoglobin urea usually do not develop AKI. And if we practice giving more fluids to these children with the purpose of causing diuresis, we may worsen their CHF because they already have severe anemia. Giving more fluids would cause more cardiac compromise and they may land up with CHF. So hydrating with something like double hydration is never advocated. Routine maintenance fluids should be given, and then packed RBC transfusion, if they are meeting the transfusion criteria, should be followed for any acute hemolytic episode. Now, what are the causes of hemoglobin urea in children? So one we already saw is G6PD deficiency. The clue to diagnosis would be exposure to a trigger of hemolysis. Obviously, it happens only in boys, being an X-linked recessive condition. So a boy who has a definite history of some drug intake, and now he has presented with acute onset hemoglobin urea. There may be similar history in other brothers of that child, or past history of similar illness. Next condition which causes hemoglobin urea is AIHE, especially the paroxysmal cold hemoglobin urea type. It typically follows a viral infection. Now, in paroxysmal cold hemoglobin urea, transfusions are usually not a problem because the cross-matching is successful. PCH, the IgG antibodies bind to the RBC at 4 degrees, but as the RBCs are exposed to higher temperature, the antibody dissociates. So cross-matching is not a problem. The complement remains fixed, so hemolysis will happen, but because the IgG has dissociated, so cross-matching is not a problem and they can easily get cross-match units. The cross-matching is a problem with warm AIHA. Next entity which can present with hemoglobin urea is PNH, paroxysmal nocturnal hemoglobin urea. And again, this does not present with acute onset hemoglobin urea. They will give you a history of recurrent episodes of hemoglobin urea, typically early morning. So this is how you detect PNH, and it can be confirmed by doing a flow cytometry for CD55 and 59.
How common is PNH in children? Either of you can answer. Is it common?
No, ma'am. It's
rare,
not common in children. It's rare, ma'am. Typically, when we screen our aplastics, we get small clones of PNH in them, but that does not manifest as PNH. Next entity which can cause hemoglobin urea is black water fever, which is a rare complication of malaria. And malaria, you would suspect when a child would present with fever and splenomegaly and then develops hemoglobin urea. So you should think about malaria. Another condition which can cause hemoglobin urea is mismatched blood transfusion. So in such a condition, child will be normal till you transfused, and hemoglobin urea would start after your transfusion. While in AIHA of PCH, the hemoglobin urea would be there even before you have transfusion. So ABO incompatibility is the cause of hemoglobin urea in this condition.
About black water fever, Dr. Nishant. Just a
Yes, sir.
comment on black water fever. My professor used to say that a common presentation, rare presentation of a common disease is the commoner than the common presentation of a rare disease. So, in
Yes.
cases of this hemoglobin or hematuria, we should never call it rare, although it is rare, but it is commoner than the AIH. Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Yes.
Definitely.
Definitely.
But are we seeing a lot of malaria now? I somehow feel the last 2-3 years malaria has gone
No,
down.
there are belts. There are belts. In Bundelkhand, malaria is common. Lucknow area, it is not that common. There are belts.
Now coming to the how to transfuse blood in a severely anemic child because of any hemolytic anemia who lands up in your ICU. Now severe anemia is a relative term. It has two facets. First is the actual hemoglobin level and the other is rate of decline. I'll give you an example. If you have a 3-year-old child with beta thalassemia major with severe anemia with hemoglobin of 2.5, and on the other hand, you have a 3-year-old child with trauma, with blood loss, with severe anemia with HB of 2.5. Now, these two children, although the hemoglobin level is same, but the management is not going to be same. In a child with acute blood loss, you can pump blood. You can give him rapid transfusion. On the other hand, a child with Thal major, the drop in hemoglobin has happened over time. So the symptoms would be minimum. He may be having CHF. So you cannot pump blood in such a child. The rate of transfusion has to be slow so that hemoglobin rise is gradual and the child's body is able to adapt to the extra volume given. On the other hand, a child with hypovolemic shock or hemorrhagic shock, you can easily replace the volume of blood which the child has lost.
Is there any role of partial exchange transfusion or something like that?
I'll come to that. Now, transfusing blood in a severely anemic child. Now, traditionally, partial exchange or exchange transfusion was advocated. I reviewed the Medline for this, and the reference which I could get was now of 1960s when exchange transfusion was being done for severe anemia. Nowadays, exchange transfusion is limited only to conditions like sickle cell disease, where in addition to correction of anemia, exchange also helps to modify the disease. Because in sickle cell, you do an exchange, you remove the sickled RBC. In malaria, if you do exchange, you remove the parasites. In neonatal hyperbil with severe anemia, you remove the antibodies, and in addition to that, you give RBCs. Apart from these conditions, just for correction of anemia, exchange transfusion nowadays is not being practiced, and because there is no evidence, hard evidence for that. So I could get 2 papers on the strategy to transfuse blood. One was this is in a randomized controlled trial where children with severe anemia without CHF. So these are children who had hemoglobin of less than 5 without CHF. The transfusion strategy which they followed was 1 ml per kg per hour versus 3 ml per kg per hour. And they found that 3 ml per kg per hour is as safe as 1 ml per kg per hour. This would translate to approximately 10 to 15 ml per kg given over 4 hours. What we traditionally do is giving 5 ml per kg if the hemoglobin is less than 5. But that can easily be increased to 10 ml per kg given over 4 hours. And the child will tolerate such transfusion easily, which this randomized control trial showed. So even if the child has hemoglobin of less than 5, you can transfuse up to 10 ml per kg over 4 hours, but you have to monitor that child carefully. You should not develop failure while you are transfusing blood. The other thing is role of furosemide as a prophylaxis. Now, again, there is no evidence for that. If the child is not in CHF, then giving furosemide for prevention of CHF is not evidence-based, and I think that can be skipped. If the child is in CHF, then definitely you'll use a diuretic because you don't want to overload the heart. The next paper was from a journal, from a study in Nigeria, where they studied transfusion of blood in severely anemic child in CHF. Now, what they did was they saw that if they were transfusing blood at a rate of 15 ml per kg over 4 hours, was the child's cardiac condition worsening after transfusion? They were monitoring the blood pressure, the heart rate, the liver size, and the oxygen saturation. And again, they found that with a transfusion of 15 ml per kg over 4 hours, these parameters did not worsen. In other words, even if the child has anemic heart failure, 15 ml per kg of PRBC can easily be transfused over 4 hours. But if the child is malnourished, then you have to be more cautious. The volume they used for malnourished children was 10 ml per kg. So even for our practice, if a child with, say, Thal major has not taken transfusion in a few months, now comes with a hemoglobin of, say, 4 grams, we can transfuse 15 ml per kg, but that should not be done in daycare. Child should be admitted, kept under close monitoring, and then 15 ml per kg PRBC can be transfused over 4 hours. So this practice can be followed. So the next group of disease which I will discuss is sickle cell disease. So sickle cell disease is caused by a mutation in the hemoglobin gene, where at 6th position beta globin gene, the glutamic acid is replaced by valine. This mutant hemoglobin polymerizes under low oxygen conditions, which leads to sickling of RBCs. So this diagram just shows what happens in sickle cell disease. This is the normal RBC with normal circulation, while in sickle cell, because of the mutant hemoglobin, these RBCs alter their shape and they polymerize. So because of polymerization, it leads to blockade of capillaries, and this is the reason why these children develop various kinds of crisis. So I will not go into the typical clinical presentation of sickle cell disease. I would only discuss conditions where a child with sickle cell disease needs an ICU care. So there are 3 kinds of crisis which a child with sickle cell can develop. One is vaso-occlusive crisis, the other is splenic sequestration crisis, and the third one is aplastic crisis. But all of you know that sickle cell disease children also develop autosplenectomy. So they are prone for infections. So acute infection is the most common cause of death in a patient with sickle cell disease. But infection in a sickle cell disease would be treated as infection in any other patient. So I'll not go into management of infection. I'll talk about the various crises. So among the vaso-occlusive crises, the most common is hand-foot syndrome, where the children present with dactylitis, painful episodes, priapism, and the most dangerous one is acute chest syndrome. This is the second most common cause of death in a child with sickle cell disease after infection. So treatment of pain crisis, so children with pain crisis do not need ICU care. It's an outpatient treatment. They just have to be told to take adequate hydration. They have to be given oral analgesics, and local heat and massage therapy is advocated. If the child is unable to take orally, then the child would be admitted, given IV hydration, given IV analgesia, and local heat and massage. ICU care is only needed for if the child has acute chest syndrome because of vaso-occlusive crisis. Now, what is acute chest syndrome? So diagnostic criteria is pretty broad. So if a child with sickle cell disease has a new onset infiltrate on chest X-ray with one or more of respiratory signs and symptoms, which could be cough, which could be tachypnea, which could be difficult pain in the chest. So any of these with a new onset infiltrate is labeled as acute chest syndrome. It is almost impossible to distinguish from infection, and we do not need to distinguish it because treatment would obviously include antibiotics. It usually happens in a patient with a prior veno-occlusive crisis. So around 80% of cases of acute chest syndrome happen in a child who already has had a veno-occlusive crisis. Now this diagram explains the pathogenesis of acute chest syndrome. Once there is a veno-occlusive crisis, the sickle RBC, they adhere and cause thrombosis in the pulmonary capillaries. This leads to pulmonary thrombosis and infarction, which can cause acute chest syndrome. The sickled RBC also releases heme, and in animal models, it has been shown that the release of heme can trigger acute chest syndrome. The vaso-occlusive crisis also lead to infarction of the bone marrow, and this bone marrow infection can lead to fat embolization and lead to acute chest syndrome. Because of bone pain, child has difficulty in breathing and develops hypoventilation, atelectasis, and this also leads to acute chest syndrome. So there are so many conditions, and of course we cannot miss infection. So there is pulmonary infection. 30% of acute chest syndrome is because of pulmonary infection. So many conditions lead to acute chest syndrome. Now, once a child develops acute chest syndrome, the VQ mismatch increases, the shunting becomes a vicious cycle. A child who develops anything which triggers leads to more and more complication happening in the same child. Now, how do we manage acute chest syndrome? So because we saw that 30% of cases are because of infection and it is almost impossible to distinguish it from pneumonia, so antibiotic therapy has to be used. And chlamydia and mycoplasma are again have been seen to be associated with acute chest syndrome in around 30% cases. So macrolide should be added empirically. So cephalosporin and macrolide, it has a strong strength of recommendation, although the quality of evidence is low. And then you have to transfuse this patient. Now, transfusion does two things. It decreases the amount of HbS, because if you transfuse, you give adult RBCs which have more of HbA, so the HbS fraction would go down. And transfusion also improves the oxygenation. It improves the oxygen carrying capacity. So you have two options: either do exchange transfusion or do simple transfusion. If you do not have access to exchange transfusion, go ahead and do a simple transfusion, because it will also be effective. But exchange transfusion would be more effective, but it needs expertise. You need to put in a double lumen central catheter. You need more blood volume to do exchange transfusion. So if a child is developing hypoxia, the distress is increasing, the infiltrates are increasing, and hemoglobin is dropping despite simple transfusion, then you will have to go for exchange transfusion. Otherwise, just doing a simple packed RBC transfusion would suffice. So when do we transfuse? If the hemoglobin is more than 1 gram per dl below the baseline for that child, especially if the baseline of that for a particular child is less than 9. So you will have to transfuse with packed RBC. So simple and exchange transfusion strategies have never been directly compared head to head in a randomized trial. So any which is available can be used. Next type of crisis which can happen in a child with sickle cell disease is splenic sequestration crisis. The child would develop sudden onset pallor, dyspnea, and abdominal distension. It typically happens in younger children because as these children age, there is autosplenectomy. So it happens only till the spleen is intact, and functional. So this again can be rapidly fatal due to hypovolemic shock, because a large volume of blood can be sequestrated in spleen. The classical lab features a fall in hemoglobin by more than 2 grams per dl. The retics would be high, and there could even be thrombocytopenia. Treatment is restoration of intravascular volume by simple packed RBC transfusion. But in this, again, we have to be careful while transfusing. We do not want to target to reach a normal hemoglobin, because after some time, the sequestered RBCs from the spleen will also be released. So if we target a normal hemoglobin by transfusion, plus the RBCs from the spleen get released, this would lead to circulatory overload, which is known as the overshoot phenomena. So we just transfuse to relieve the child's symptoms. We do not target to reach a normal hemoglobin in splenic sequestration crisis. The next type of crisis is aplastic crisis. Now, aplastic crisis is distinguished from sequestration crises by the retic count will not be high. There would be pallor, there would be fatigue, there would be no jaundice, and spleen size will not increase, and the retic count would be low, which is high in sequestration crisis. It is most commonly caused by parvovirus B19 infection, which has a trophism for immature RBCs. So children with sickle cell disease are dependent on rapid hemolysis, rapid RBC production. So anything which hampers the normal production will lead to worsening of anemia, which is the case in aplastic crisis, parvovirus B19 infection. Again, it's usually a self-limiting disease. Spontaneous recovery happens in 7 to 10 days. Some patients in whom the hemoglobin has dropped quite significantly, child has developed symptomatic anemia, then they would require PRBC transfusion. Now, this is the summary slide of all the complications in sickle cell disease. We already saw acute chest syndrome. There is aplastic crisis. There is splenic sequestration crisis. There is multi-organ failure syndrome. Typically follows the acute chest syndrome. There could be multi-organ dysfunction if more than 2 organ systems are involved. These patients would require simple or exchange transfusion. There is hyperhemolytic crisis. Now, this happens after they develop transfusion reaction. So if they are transfused RBC, they develop alloantibody mediated hemolysis, then this would lead to a hyperhemolytic crisis. And as for autoimmune hemolytic anemia, they would need steroids, IVIG, for management of hyperhemolytic crisis. So I am skipping stroke and hepatic sequestration crisis because they are very, very uncommon in children. So this is all about the ICU care of a child with hemolytic anemia. If there are any questions, I would be very happy to answer.
Thank you, Dr. Nishant. Excellent combination of a case followed by the discussion on the diagnosis and disease, and the patient also had needed ICU care, so the ICU management. So any questions from the audience? I cannot see any question in the chat box, so you be please unmute and ask your questions.
I will start by asking. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Dr. Ajay.
No, please, Dr. Banani.
Okay. How common is sickle in? Do you see it in Lucknow?
Ma'am, I have around 3 patients who are registered with me, and most of them are not originally from Lucknow. One is from Nepal and 2 are from Chhattisgarh. So in UP, we usually don't see homozygous sickle. We have few S-beta, sickle beta thalassemia, which presents more like Hal major.
Yeah.
Like this.
That's
You can
My
stop sharing.
experience also the same. We have a few cases of sickle cell anemia in my practice. I have seen they are usually migrant laborers, or they have migrated primarily from Chhattisgarh area only. Local North Indian population, I don't see any sickle cell anemia in that. Of course, in Sindhi families and Rajasthan side, we have thalassemia and all.
thalassemia is quite prevalent.
Yeah.
And another situation in which we used to get a lot of IV hemolysis related to G6PD deficiency, especially as I said, I've seen a lot of these cases in Chandigarh. That is hepatitis A virus. So you have hepatitis and suddenly you will find that the child is presenting with bilirubins ranging between 25 to 30. And then you take a history and you will get a classical history of, Coca-Cola colored urine. So that this used to be the classical thing that we used to see. And yes, you're absolutely right that I have not seen many of them going into AKI, and we used to just transfuse them and they used to get better. Yes. Surprisingly, when I have seen, I think 2 patients here in SGPGI, one of them had gone into complete shutdown and he required dialysis for quite a while, and then he got better. And multiple intervening complications while he was in the ICU, needed ventilation and those kind of things. So that patient was an eye-opener that yes, AKI can happen, and he took almost 6 months to get back to normal renal function. He had some weird hyperkalemia and some tubular dysfunctions. So that was quite strange actually.
Actually, my experience, ma'am, was when I was working in Iran for a couple of years. I have worked there and I saw many cases of G6PD deficiency. And the moment there was fava-bean season, we used to have so many cases coming with sudden onset of anemia with hemoglobinuria. So, that often used to be the first time when G6PD was being diagnosed clinically. So what we used to do in all these cases, considering that such a massive hemolysis, we routinely used to alkalinize the urine. If urine output was low, then we used to do a little bit of diuresis also by giving Lasix and all. And with that experience, maybe not less than 500 cases I have managed, and I never found anybody having AKI. So this used to be the recommendation there also, that alkalinize the urine in all such cases.
Alkalinization is not recommended any longer actually. Yeah, it used to be a thought, and there was a justification giving that when you alkalinize the urine, they don't get deposited in the kidney. But subsequent studies have proven that it is not required. Blood needs to be given, their hemoglobin needs to be maintained. It is actually the ischemia because of the low hemoglobin which affects the kidney tubules and causes AKI. It is not the deposition of the hemoglobin in an alkaline urine. in an acidic urine. So now that is no longer proven. In fact, I think in the beginning of our junior residency, we used to do alkalinization of urine and all that. But subsequently, as we became more senior and towards the end of our senior residency, Dr. Marwa came up with these studies, because in those days, residents would find it very difficult to go through literature. It was not so easily available. It's not like you tap on your Google and you get all your information. So he came up and told us that this is now no longer recommended, and we stopped doing it actually. And it was just blood transfusions. So yes, it is something that used to be done.
Ma'am, I'm talking about the year 1985 to say 1989 or so.
Yeah, naturally. So this is
so
after
I'm talking
that.
about
Yeah.
those days when I was there.
Sure.
Thank you, sir. So I will bind up with one last question on the case, and I will hand over to Dr. Neeta Bhargav. So coming back to the case, Dr. Siddharth, and I would like to respond from Dr. Archana Kumar. This patient came when CHF and PRBC were transfused on day 1 and 2, and on day 2 IVIG DCT was given. Then there was rebound decrease in hemoglobin with inotrope support requiring ventilation. So was it the this transfusion reaction, or was something else? Madam, you are muted.
Unmute yourself, ma'am.
So that is slightly difficult to differentiate, and that is precisely what we were
Yes.
talking at that time, no? That
Yeah.
This could be related to a transfusion reaction, but because it is quite common to have a transfusion reaction in these children, considering they have so many antibodies. But as Dr. Nishant said, we have to go ahead and do it again. On the other hand, it could just be a rapid hemolysis.
Yeah, correct.
So you do have to give a transfusion in any case. Whatever be the
And you don't know, they gave antibiotics, they ventilated him. So whether there was some infection, whether infection to start with, infection along the way. After all, an anemic child is like a immunocompromised child, and he could have picked up an infection. So possibly the fact that they intubated, ventilated, gave inotropes, gave antibiotics, that helped. So in this situation, I would say that antibiotics were completely justified, and you cannot go away from the fact that we say a lot of things and say no antibiotics, but we end up giving them too many, and I suppose it still works.
But this rapid recurrent hemolysis is very well known in autoimmune hemolytic anemias. Okay, like you may have to give a whole lot of blood to a child at times. One day he's fine, he's got 2 transfusions, next day he comes back with 2 grams.
Yes.
So you have to think about, you need to give blood transfusion to these kids.
Ma'am, I have another query. In say private practice, or particularly in periphery, when we are suspecting acute hemolytic anemia, and we are almost sure that it is an acute hemolytic anemia, before giving blood transfusion or simultaneously while we are giving transfusion, even steroids should be started early. If we cannot classify it, just giving steroids and with blood transfusion, or say IVIG followed by blood transfusion, will it not help in a better way?
Steroids is a better option as compared to IVIG, but only we should be absolutely sure it is not an underlying secondary cause like a malignancy which is caused.
Okay.
That is all.
So steroids can be given unless until there is a secondary cause.
They should be given. They should be given in autoimmune hemolytic anemia.
No, before transfusion.
Yes, why not? Why not before transfusion? They should be given along with the transfusion. You arrange for a transfusion and give steroids. In fact, if you really sick, go ahead and give methylprednisolone.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to know.
May not be needed by all. Steroids will be needed by all.
Yes, steroids you have to give.
So that was what our GPs
Steroids is
were.
a better option than IVIG actually.
Yeah.
IVIG will be more effective in situations like Evans syndrome, where you also have autoimmune
Platelet destruction.
Platelet destruction. IVIG is more effective there. So the
DCT
first
must
line
be done.
is
Yes, I agree. I don't think I I would go away from the fact that you should not do DCT. DCT needs to be done, and if you are not able to do DCT, then maybe just give the transfusion and quickly refer him after stabilization, rather than making it difficult for the subsequent person also to make the diagnosis.
Absolutely.
So in fact, nowadays, even just DCT is not enough. You have to do a monospecific Coombs for with
Absolutely.
IgG.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
DCT is not
classify
enough.
Investigations are becoming more and more sophisticated. So actually, I was surprised and intrigued that this patient could afford IVIG, but we said he could not afford further tests of his characterization of the antibody, whether it was.
I suppose it was the COVID time and going to PGI.
Okay. Yeah, I agree. Yes, definitely.
I'd advise that send him to PGI. Everything will be done there. But then they said, no, it cannot be. He is not willing to go there.
Ma'am, don't send kids to PGI. I don't feel confident all the time.
और कौन करता है आप बताइए ना.
मैं ज्यादा नहीं बोलूंगी, मेरा इंस्टीट्यूट है तो उसकी बदनामी तो नहीं कर सकते.
डायरेक्ट एंटीग्लोबुलिन टेस्ट कहाँ होता है? अच्छा.
I don't know.
Even I'm not sure. I was not very happy with KGNU either. We hardly ever got it positive.
So is it the blood bank who does it, or it's a hemat department?
The blood bank does it, ma'am, but it only does the direct Coombs and indirect. It does not do monospecific. For that, we send it to transfusion medicine in SGPGI.
So that's what I'm asking. In SGPGI, who does it? Again, it is transfusion medicine.
No, both do it, ma'am.
Both of them.
Hematology as well as transfusion medicine. Both.
Okay. Hemat now has a fantastic lab set up because they have 3 very good trained hematologists.
Thank you, madam.
Close
the discussion. I hand over to Dr. Neeta Bhargav.
Now our session, we end our session here. But before that, I would like to thank Archana Kumar madam for her valuable guidance in the case management in Vivekananda Polyclinic.
Good evening, everyone.
And a very informative talk on autoimmune hemolytic anemia. And we are blessed to have madam with us. And I'm thankful to Dr. Nishant Verma also for, as usual, very short, crisp and very interesting talk. And I'm thankful to Dr. Sanjay Niranjan for chairing this session. And thank you, Dr. Siddharth, for good presentation. And I would like to thank our viewers, senior doctors and my dear colleagues for taking out their precious time and weekend. And lastly, I'm thankful to TLAB team, our president, Dr. Ajay Kumar sir, Secretary Dr. T.R. Yadav and Vice President Dr. Anurag Katiyar for providing us TLAB platform, and special thanks to Dr. Anurag Katiyar for technical help. Thank you so much.
What is the D in DLAB?
Ma'am, it's a digital platform of lab.
Okay. Dr. Ajay wants to say something. Okay. Good night.
Platform has worked wonderful.
Okay.
Smooth running was due to him.
Yeah. Anurag.
It went off pretty smoothly.
Thank you, Anurag. Very good.
Last year, we have conducted 150 webinars because of this digital platform.
So my suggestion is that many of the meetings can continue on the digital platform. Nobody has to be in this horrible Lucknow traffic. This is a good enough thing. Only people will miss the dinner. People can order food and have the dinner at home.
Dr. Banane, Anurag and LAP team 2020 has done DLAP so well that LAP is graded the best branch of IAP in the country, second best branch in the country.
Very nice. Congratulations.
And 14 awards are there at National Pedicon.
Good. Very good. Chalo, good.
Thank you.
Okay. Good night.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Okay, good night.
Good night.
Leave meeting. Bye.